I'm going to quickly comment on is this one, what the prophets saw. Just a quick recap of the last session, then we're going to move on to talk about calendars, to move things on to the next level and to understand how to get exact dates. You have to understand the calendars in operation. And so what the prophets saw, just to recap, is kind of interesting. The prophets saw the sufferings of Christ and then the glory of Christ. But what they didn't see was the gap in between. It's like looking at two mountains in the distance. You see one, then the other. Maybe they're pretty much on top of each other, or maybe they're separated by a big valley. They couldn't see that. God didn't reveal that to them because, in a sense, Israel hadn't made the decision yet, which would determine if the glory would come straight after the sufferings or 2,000 years after. Well, we know now. We live in that valley. We live in the church age, the mystery age that wasn't revealed. And we've looked back to the sufferings and we look forward to the glory of Christ. But Daniel, 70 weeks, saw both of those. In verse 24, he saw the sufferings and the glory at the end of the 490 years. Then, verse 26 indicates that the Messiah would come and suffer as predicted at the end of the 490 years. But then Daniel, verse 27, indicates that the judgment followed by the glory of the Messiah would happen at some future time, at the end of some future 70th week. What is the solution to this paradox? And it's Sir Edward Denny, that we've met before, who we credit with this wonderful revelation, though it wasn't received at the time within the Brethren. He was an Irish baronet in the Brethren. He saw it, and he saw that, in fact, the 70th week runs twice. Ran the first time, was cancelled, and rerun the second time because of the rejection of the Messiah. Once you realize this, Daniel's 70 weeks work absolutely perfectly. I'm going to show you that we can actually calculate the start and finish of it from April the 3rd to April the 3rd, 490 years, it was fulfilled to the day, with a climactic day of the great manifest day of the Lord, the resurrection. Not only that, I'll be able to show you, because we know exactly how long the tribulation is, from Daniel and from Revelation, we know to the day how long the tribulation is. We can also calculate the 7-year length of time of John the Baptist and Jesus, because of the date, as I'll show you how to do it, and it's exactly the same to the day. Why are they the same length of time? Because one is a repeat of the other. You see? Chronologically repeats it and replaces it. Now we're going to get on to calendars. There's a sheet on calendars. If some of this passes you by, don't worry too much, but I want to show you that we know what we're talking about here, okay? With chronology, you have to get everything exact. Near enough is not good enough, all right? Now, there are different calendars that mankind has used, all right? But fundamentally, there are two kinds of calendar, because God gave the sun and the moon, didn't he, to govern the day and the night and the seasons. So some calendars, the calendar that we use, we ignore the moon. See, if we were in a different culture, like in Arabia, for instance, we would be watching the moon all the time. The moon would be the most exciting thing happening, all right? Because our whole timekeeping would be run by the moon. Because what is a month, really? It's a month. It's a moon, all right? A new moon is a new month. And so lunar calendars are governed by the moon, all right? Solar calendars are governed by the sun. And each has their advantage. But the calendar that God gave Israel was the best calendar of all, because it was a luni-solar calendar. It kept in step with the moon and with the sun. And I'll show you how they did that. But let me talk about solar calendars. Now, a solar calendar, basically the year, you'll see there, the key moments of the year is the spring equinox that we've just passed. It's meant to be spring, but it doesn't seem like it yet. March the 21st, thereabouts, is the spring equinox. It's called equinox because that's pretty well when the sun is over the equator. All right, and then the height of the summer is the summer solstice. All right, when the sun is furthest north, and then you're back to the autumnal equinox, and then the winter solstice in December. Those are the 4 key points of the solar year, which divide the year into its 4 seasons. Okay? Now, solar calendars are always based on the equinoxes. In fact, the proper, you might say, the perfect solar calendar, you might be surprised to know, is the one used in Iran. The Persian solar calendar is really the best, because it starts every year on the equinox, the spring equinox. They have 6 31-day months, which take you to the autumn equinox, and then 6 30-day months, pretty much, taking you back. And that gives you a perfect solar calendar based on the equinoxes. On the advanced chronology, I'll explain why that's important. But I just want to give you a taste of some different calendars. All right. Now, the solar calendar. Now, the thing is, though, it doesn't keep in step with the moon, of course, at all. It ignores the moon. Now, the calendar that we're familiar with is called the Gregorian calendar. But to understand that, we've got to go back. We are actually on a Roman calendar. That's why, it's actually started with Julius Caesar in 46 BC. He established what was called the Julian calendar. And that's the basis, really, for the calendar we use today. Now, originally, it was started in March, because that's the spring equinox. But Julius Caesar, for some reason, decided to make January the 1st the start of the year. For some Roman reason, I'm not quite sure. But you can see why. You see, some of the month names, say November, what is it? August, Sept. See, what's Sept? 7th month. Well, it isn't. It's the 9th month, is it? Because originally they started in March with the equinox. But Julius Caesar, for his own reasons, they started January the 1st, all right? So that's a muck-up, but anyway. Now, the Julian calendar is basically a solar year. How many days in a solar year? 365. All right? 365. Now, I'm introducing a name called intercalation in a minute. But a solar year is basically 365 days. But, as you find with calendars, nothing is exactly so. All right? Because actually it's not, is it? What would happen if we just had a simple 365-day year every year? And what would happen is gradually we would slip against the seasons. Do you know why? Because of that quarter day. The solar year is really more like 365 and a quarter days. So if it was simply 365 days, can you see that every year you would slip back about 6 hours? Now that might not seem much. But after 100 years, you'll have slipped back 25 days. So, if you wait long enough, then, July will be midwinter. And you don't want a calendar that slips against the seasons. The whole point of a solar calendar, for agriculture and everything, you plant your crops in whenever, March. Everything's fixed on the seasons. So what do? Well, every 4 years, we add 20, I don't know why, it's the 29th of February, isn't it? That's a leap year. Now, the word for that is intercalation. It's a little bit of fix-it going on. Every 4 years, you fix it by adding an extra day, and that just bumps everything back into line again. All right? That's called intercalation. You have an extra day added in. By the way, the Egyptian calendar in old times they used to have 12 30-day months, giving you 360 days. Because 360 does come up. Some of the ancient years were kind of basically 360-day years. But, of course, every year you'd slip 5 days, wouldn't you? That's no good, so what do? They intercalated. They have their 12 months, but then they had a special 5 days at the end of the year before the next year started. That's intercalation, all right? You add 5 days in. This is preparing you to understand the Jewish calendar, all right? But before we get there, let's talk about the Julian calendar, which actually intercalated, because that's the best of their knowledge back then, that you add a day every 4 years. But hey, guess what? Even that isn't quite right. All right? Because after a few hundred years, in fact, the actual solar year, I've got it there on the sheet, is slightly less than a quarter. And the effect of that is it slips 1 day every 133 years. Well, so what, you might think, But by the time it was 1582, 1,500 years of church history, right? It's actually slipped. Well, actually, it slipped 10, 12 days from the time of Christ. The calendar has slipped. And so the church authorities, led by Pope Gregory, realized we've got to do something about this. Because their main concern was the Easter, you see. All the dates are slipping back. So we've got to bring things back into line and improve the calendar, all right? I'm telling you this because it's a bit of interesting history, but it is actually important. Otherwise, you can get confused in the area of chronology, which I'll explain in a minute. So by 1582, there were riots on this year because they decided that rather than fix the calendar to the time of Christ, unfortunately, they didn't adjust it back to that. They adjusted it back to the Council of Trent, which was one of the really important church councils in 325 AD. So don't ask me why, but that's what they did, all right? So it had slipped 10 days since then. So what they did is they made a 10-day adjustment. So what happened in this famous year, and they wanted to fix the date of Easter. As I said, that was their main motivation. So one day, it was the 4th of October, 1582, and the next day was not the 5th of October. The people woke up in the morning and they were told it's the 15th of October. 10 days. There were riots in the streets. They've stolen 10 days from my life, So anyway, in that way, it was readjusted. It was readjusted back. All right. And at that time, they brought in what's called the Gregorian calendar that we use now. Now, the only difference was a tiny adjustment. Do you know what the difference is? It's not quite once every 4 years, is it now? In fact, we've just passed the century mark. What they did was, yes, you have a leap year every 4 years, but you do not have it on the century. That was the tweak that they made. But, there's another little tweak, but every 400 years, there is a leap year. So actually, in 2000, it would have been normal, actually. So forgive me, anyway. But anyway, they tweaked it. All right, slight adjustment to the leap year rule. And now, the present calendar we use, for all intents and purposes, is bang on. It stays in line with the sun. It would take tens of thousands of years before it shifted off now. It's really close. So the present calendar, the Gregorian, is pretty well true solar now, because we've got the leap years right. All right? Now, the reason that this is important to us is that in the time of Jesus, I think you're doing really well if you can't, just as long as you kind of understand what I mean, it'll be enough, all right? In the time of Jesus, what was the calendar in use? It was the Julian calendar, all right? The Gregorian only came in 1582. Now, when I say Jesus was crucified on April the 1st, AD 33, what works best in my mind, to be honest, is that is according to the present Gregorian calendar. All right, that gives you the exact solar lineup. But in terms of the calendar they used at the time, it was actually April the 3rd. So you might read in some books, oh, Derek, you might think, Derek's got it wrong. It says here, Jesus was crucified on April the 3rd, because on the whole, that is the more commonly accepted date. You know, I'm convinced that's right. But you might find some places April the 3rd. Didn't Derek say April the 1st for the crucifixion? You see, do you understand? There's a 2-day difference because of this thing. Because they adjusted it to the Council of Trent. 300 years later, in which there was a 2-day discrepancy. So, when you read historical books, the rules that historians follow, when they give dates, you know, back time of Christ and before, all the dates are given in the Julian calendar. In the time of Christ, that's 2 days different from the calendar that we would use, because our calendar didn't exist back then. But so when I give you a date, unless I say otherwise, I'm actually talking in our calendar. Do you understand? Yeah. But in the time of Christ, the dates are actually 2 days different. So I say that because otherwise that will save you from potential confusion if you study this. So that also gives you a taste for how difficult chronology can be sometimes. Because you've got all these different calendars, all right? You've got to be very clear in your mind which calendar you're measuring things by. All right. So, and then there was one more calendar we should mention. The ancient Babylonian calendar does appear in Scripture too, which was called a time. A year of 360 days, which appears in Daniel and Revelation. And that's called a time. You know, a time, times, and half a time. And that's defined as 1,260 days. A time was 360 days. That was a very ancient calendar. That's why we have 360 degrees in a circle. All right? A degree is a sign, is a sun. 360 suns, 360 days in the year, you see. But, of course, that needed intercalation. And this was quite a good, clever calendar, actually, because what you find is that, let's take you through this intercalation, then you'll understand the Jewish calendar. Let's say we're working on a 360-day year. Everything's nice and neat. Every month is 30 days. Simple. All right? After 1 year, how far have we fallen behind? About 5 days, right? After 2 years, 10 days. After 4 years, actually 21 days, all right? After 6 years, about 31 days, right? Now we've fallen back by a whole month. So what do? At the end of this 6th year, we add in a 13th month, an extra month, all right? At the end of the year, and that year is actually 390 days because you have the 13th month. That's an intercalated month. You add that in, and things are back in line again. You see that? That's how that would have worked. Because you've got to keep it in line with the seasons. But then, of course, the Muslim calendar. How do the Muslims measure time now? It's lunar. And a lunar calendar, it means every month you watch the moon. And every time you see a new moon crescent, start of a new month. And a moon goes through its phases about once every 29.5 days. So a lunar calendar tends to go 30 days, 29 days, 30 days, 29 days. See? Tends to be like that, with a few exceptions. And a whole lunar year is 12 of those, which is 354 days. Now that's why Ramadan moves through the year. It's a different time every year. Because in their Muslim calendar, which is a simple lunar calendar, it doesn't stay in line with the sun. It drops by 11 days every year. All right? So, Ramadan's moving through the seasons every year. When we went to Israel, it was Ramadan back then in October, end of October, which was unfortunate. But by now, 3 years later, Ramadan will have moved back to September, I guess, something like that. Yeah, well, it just moves through the seasons, you see, because it's a lunar year. And that's not ideal, obviously, because you'd like to know, I plant my crops in March, you know, and I reap my harvest in April or whatever, So it's not ideal. But at least the moon, God gave the moon for months. So what's the best calendar of all? And it's the calendar God gave Israel. The Jewish calendar, that's our next sheet. And it's wonderful that we do have, the dates in the Bible are generally in the Jewish calendar. And it was kept in line, it's lunisolar, which means it's kept in line with the moon and with the sun. And because it's kept in line with the moon, the feasts were pegged to the position of the moon. And astronomically, we can calculate, backwards in time, we can know exact dates. Because when they say the Passover, we know that's the 14th of the month. That's the 14th day since the new moon. We can calculate, and in your notes I've given some examples of some tables you can get. It's wonderful now, you can get anything on the internet. We can calculate the exact dates of the feasts in any particular year, because they're pegged to the moon. And that's astronomically fixed. See? So it's a blessing. So I've drawn a picture. This is to show you how the phases of the moon work, all right? Hopefully you'll understand. Here's the sun on the left. We're here on the earth, and the moon, of course, is going around the earth. The same side of the moon is always facing the earth, but anyway. Imagine that the moon is in between the earth and the sun, there on the left. Can you see that? The sun is shining on the moon. Of course, we see the moon is the reflected light from the sun. But can you see that the other side of the moon will be dark? Because it's on the other side of the sun's rays. So that's dark. Now, looking from Earth's point of view, we in that position, the moon is dark. I call it dark moon. It's the conjunction. And you cannot see the moon at that time. All right? What can happen at that time is what's called a solar eclipse. Can you see? These are the only moments when a solar eclipse is possible, because the moon sometimes will actually exactly line up with the sun and blot out the sun. And that's a solar eclipse. A solar eclipse can only happen at the dark moon. Do you see that? Now, by the way, this is a proof that the darkness that happened at the cross, the supernatural darkness, could not have been an eclipse, because it was at Passover, which is when the moon is full. You see, the moon was on the other side of the earth. Now, imagine now, as the moon moves around the earth, it's waxing, waxing and waning, old-fashioned expression. Waxing means, as the month begins, the month hasn't started yet, by the way, because we can't see the moon. The month starts the first time you see that new crescent. So as it moves around, gradually, more and more of the moon, of the side of the moon that's lit up, will come into view. All right? If we go around 90 degrees, it's more obvious. Can you see at the top, the moon actually at the top, the sun is shining on it, and at that point you can see about half the moon is lit up. The other half is in darkness. All right? As you go around, the moon goes to the other side, the whole of the moon is lit up. And that's a full moon. That's halfway through the month, pretty much. And then, of course, it goes round and it gets smaller again, and that's the end of the month. Now, a lunar eclipse, of course, can only happen at full moon. A lunar eclipse is when the sun shining on the earth. Can you see at full moon, the moon is on the opposite side to the earth. Sorry, the opposite side from the sun. And what can happen in the lunar eclipse is that the sun shining on the earth casts a shadow over the moon. And if it's all exactly aligned, that will happen every few years. Right? It will cast a shadow, and very often that shadow makes the moon turn red, blood red. That's going to be important later on. All right? That happens at a full moon. So you can only have a lunar eclipse. Let me tell you why that's important, because this is wonderful. You can only have a lunar eclipse at a full moon. Now, the full moon is at the middle of the month. All the major feasts were at the middle of the month. Passover the 14th, Tabernacles, the 15th of the 7th month. They're all at full moons. The major feasts were at full moons. They would have celebrations, by the way, at the new moons, New Moon Festival, but the major feast tended to start at the full moon. Now, Joel prophesied that before the great and terrible day of the Lord, the moon would be turned to blood. One of the signs just before the end of the 70th week was to be a lunar eclipse. The moon would be turned to blood. I'll show you later that there was indeed, on the very day that Jesus was crucified, as the moon came above the horizon that evening as they were burying Jesus, the moon was turned to blood. There was a lunar eclipse, and that is one of the proofs that indeed April the 1st was the day of the crucifixion. In fact, Joel prophesied there would be two signs in the heavens connected with the climax of the 70th week. Number one, the sun will be turned to darkness. That happened on the day of the cross at midday. Amos 8, I think, predicts that the sun would turn darkness at noon, and it did. The sun would be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great day of the Lord's manifestation. In fact, it was 2 days before. And that was fulfilled. And so when Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost and said, Joel's prophecy has been fulfilled through Jesus Christ, the Spirit has been poured out on all flesh, and in conjunction with that was two signs in the heavens, and all the people there knew that 50 days before that happened. The moon was turned to blood, and the sun was turned to darkness. One was a natural sign, but a rare natural sign, and the other one was the supernatural sign. And exactly the same thing is going to happen at the repeat. This is glorious. At the repeat. Because Joel's prophecy, in some sense, has been fulfilled, but in another sense, the final fulfillment hasn't happened yet, has it? Because Daniel's 70th week is to be repeated. So what do we read in Revelation chapter 6? Let's go there, actually. We know, don't we, that Jesus even said that just before his coming, there would be a supernatural darkness, didn't he? It says, you know that, don't they? There's a blackout, and then he says you'll see the sign of the Son of Man in the heavens. You know? So there's going to be, the supernatural darkness is going to happen again. Why? Because it's the repeat of Daniel's 70th week. What else is going to happen again? Revelation 6. Now, let me explain the seals. Are slightly different to the trumpets. The 6 seals, the 7 seals, in the tribulation, at the start of the tribulation, these different seals are open. But the events of these seals keep going through the whole tribulation. There are different aspects of the horrors that are going to happen. With the trumpets, what you find is there's the first trumpet, then the first trumpet's over, that judgment is done, you're into the second trumpet, and so on. But what you find with the seals is that they continue through. I won't go through the seals, but the 6th seal is where I want to look at, which actually talk about the fact that in the tribulation there will be catastrophic signs in the earth, in the oceans, physical disturbances of a magnitude greater than even what we're aware of now. And in fact, he actually shows the culmination of this 6th seal just coming up to the second coming of Christ, because you can't really read it in any other way. Verse 12, Revelation 6:12, I watched as he opened the 6th seal, there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth. That happens just near the end, just before the Lord returns. The sun is turned to darkness again. And the whole moon turned blood red. In other words, we've got exactly the same 2 signs happening in the tribulation right at the end. The moon turned to blood. In fact, this time it will be a total lunar eclipse. That's why, one of the reasons why Jesus will return at Tabernacles. Because some people think, well, maybe he'll come at one of the feasts in the 7th month. Maybe it's Rosh Hashanah in the first day of the month. Well, it couldn't be that. Because just before the Lord returns, there's going to be a lunar eclipse, and that can only happen at full moon. which confirms he'll actually return on the Day of Tabernacles. Anyway, and then it talks about other catastrophic events that are actually, it's clear that it's imminent, just before the Lord actually returns, the great and manifest day of the Lord, which will be his second coming. All right, that's a bit of a diversion there. Now, how do we do our lunar calculations? This is what I'm going to show you now, how to use your lunar tables. It's back to school today. Now, the motion of the moon, the visibility of the lunar crescent is actually very complicated. But I can give you a rule of thumb. Now, the way the Jews would do it in the time of Jesus, they'd have people all over the land. They knew roughly when the moon would appear. But they could only proclaim the new month, especially the new year, when the moon was actually seen. And they had a whole procedure, and the witness would come in for questioning, and they'd say, I've seen the new crescent of the moon. They'd be looking out, and they'd ask him questions to see if he was a genuine witness. Once it was in, and of course you start to see the moon near around sunset time. So they knew pretty well when the moon should appear again. And when the moon was seen, then they sanctified the new moon. You're into the new month. Now, how can we calculate back to work out when the new months are? And here's a simple rule. The moon, when it's dark moon, you can't see it, obviously. The other problem is it's quite close to the sun, so that also makes it hard. It's kind of close to being in line with the sun. Makes it hard to see. In fact, it will not be visible normally to the naked eye until about 30 hours later. All right? 30 hours later. So the rule of thumb is, you've got to know exactly when the dark moon is. That's what the tables will tell us. Then, the moon can be seen roughly at 6 o'clock in the evening. All right? Now, here's another thing you need to know. The Jewish day, our days, start at midnight. When did the Jewish day start? Sunset. Exactly right. So, when I say the 3rd of April, for example, I actually mean, in the Jewish idea, 6 o'clock. It's that day started at 6 o'clock on the 2nd of April. But for ease of talk, it's the 3rd of April, all right? But actually, it's from 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock. It starts in the evening, all right? So, to know what is the day of the new moon, you're looking out, if you can see the moon, and you can probably see it if it's 30 days old. It's 30 hours old, all right? If it's 30 hours old, that means, basically, you see if 6 o'clock the moon is 30 hours old or not. If it's not, then you've got to wait till the next day before the new month starts. I'll show you how this works in a minute. But that's how you work out when a month starts. From that, you can work out when Passover is, when all the feast days are. We can actually assign a date to that, simply based on the visibility of the new moon. All right? Okay, but before we get on to that, we've got to deal with a problem. Let me say this, that the next sheet is called intercalation. Let me explain now how it worked. How did they keep it in line with the sun? Now, if you read in Exodus, when God gave them the calendar, God said to them, this is the first, the Exodus happened in spring. It was in the month of Abib. Abib is a term referring to barley. It's the time of the barley harvest. When they offered up the first fruits in Abib, that was the barley harvest being offered up. All right? So God was saying right then, this is the first month. Just some little fact to put under your hat for now. In fact, at that time it was the 7th month, because before the Exodus, the calendar was based on the autumn equinox. It was actually the 7th month, and God actually said, now I want you to make this the first month. He made a 6-month adjustment. That's why the Jews still celebrate Rosh Hashanah as their new year, which is actually the first day of their 7th month. It's a remnant from when they used to start their year back then. But actually God says, I want you to start your year now in Abib, in the spring. There's a reason for that, because he told them the feasts. And that was the start of the sacred year now, and their year was in Abib. Now, why is that? Because the first feast was Passover. These feasts are prophetic. The Passover is prophetic, of course, of Christ's first coming. Then came Pentecost, which is prophetic of the church age. And then came the 7th month feasts, which are prophetic of the second coming. So God had to start his revelation of the feasts, had to start in Abib. It's related to the harvests and all of that. Right. So, here we are. He says, right, we're going to start the new year in Abib in the spring. So, how are they going to do it? It's lunisolar, but he says each year the year has to start with Abib, which is related to barley, which is the harvest. Can you see? We can't let it slip 11 days a year, like the Arabs have their lunar year, because soon Abib would be in the middle of the winter. That's no good. So they've got to do something to keep it in line with the sun. And this is what they did, and it's wonderful. After 1 year, they fall behind about 11 days, right? That's fine, no panic. After 2 years, you've fallen behind 22 days. After 3 years, 33 days. What do? We add in a 13th month. The 12th month was called Adar, so the 13th month was called the second Adar. They'd have a 13th month of 30 days, that they put that in. Are we in the Jewish calendar? Hey, there you go. That's the intercalated month. Now, we're back almost in line again. And we go through this whole thing again. In fact, our old records tell us that they would add, let me say this, that the present Jewish calendar isn't exactly the biblical calendar. There's a Jewish rabbi that they all revere called Maimonides. In about 400 years after Christ, he made up the rules. And he overcomplicated it, and he added all kinds of, the way they do. The Pharisees would add their extra rules. You can't have this on this day and all of the rest. So he complicated it, and it means that it's not quite right now. So the present Jewish calendar isn't necessarily right, although it's close. But anyway, what they originally did, they added an intercalated month every 3 years, then 6 years, and then 8 years. They had an 8-year cycle. So they'd add 3 every 8 years. Do you know what the amazing thing about that is? If you do that 6 times, 6 8s we're getting close to Jubilee. Everything was based around Jubilee. Then on the 49th year, they didn't add it on. And in a whole Jubilee cycle, there would have been, how many? 18 intercalations. And every time they'd gone through 49 years, they were back in line with the sun perfectly. So every Jubilee cycle, it was nicely back in line with the sun. The whole thing was based on Jubilee again. And so in that way, although the start of the year varies a bit every year by a few days, essentially it's lunar, but it's also solar, because it's kept in line with the sun. It's a wonderful calendar, because our calendar just ignores the moon. Theirs is in step with the moon and the sun. It was the superior calendar, but God meant that a solar calendar covered the church age. Israel's governed by a lunisolar calendar, but the church is governed by a solar calendar, it would seem. All right. Well, if you got through that, you're doing well. All right. Have we covered? Yes. That's intercalations. Good. It's like having a birthday on the 29th of February, isn't it? Simon's is on the 28th, so that was a close one. Yeah. Mm. Well, let's quickly talk about the feasts. So you have a basic familiarity of the feasts, because God pegs all his major events onto the feasts. The feast of the first month, that's the next two sheets really. The first month is called Abib, right? Then they took on the Babylonian name, which was Nisan. So often it's called Nisan. All right, same thing as Abib. It started in the spring. Now the rule is, God said to them, you must keep the feasts in their seasons. So that meant the Passover had to be kept in the spring. So the rule was, the Passover had to be after the spring equinox. So whenever the year slipped back earlier than that, you had to add an intercalated month. Because if the Passover was too early, then, soon after the Passover is the Feast of First Fruits. And, you can't lift up the barley unless it's ready. So that's why there's the spring, which meant in effect that Nisan the 1st could not start before 8th or 9th or 10th of March. That's the earliest possible. By the way, this is one reason why the Anderson interpretation of the 490 years cannot be true, because it's a fiddle that requires, in fact, that they start the year way too early. In fact, the improved version, so-called improved version, that they tend to follow now, as you come across it, requires you starting the Nisan in the 28th of February, which is way too early and cannot be true. So anyway, the first of Nisan's the new moon of the spring. Could be just before the spring equinox or just after. Then on the 10th of Nisan, the Passover lamb is set aside. And this is all prophetic, of course. Then the Passover lamb is sacrificed on the 14th. And it was sacrificed between the evenings. Now people get unstuck on this. I was talking to Brian about this. I did a special research on this. And the Passover lamb, Josephus tells us they sacrificed the Passover lambs from between 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. People are confused by the term between the evenings. They had two evenings. The first evening is when the sun begins to set, about 3 o'clock. In fact, that was we talk about the time of the evening sacrifice. The time of the morning sacrifice was 9 in the morning. I think Daniel says, I lift up my hand, I pray to God, isn't it? The morning sacrifice and at noon and the afternoon, or the evening sacrifice. The evening sacrifice was not sunset. The evening sacrifice was 3 in the afternoon. That's the first evening. The second evening, see, they'd have different watches during the night as well, In the same way, they'd have two evenings. So there's the evening at 3 o'clock, and then there's sunset, which is the second evening. So between the evenings is between 3 and 6 o'clock. So that's when the Passover lambs were sacrificed. But to be safe, they had to be sure that it wasn't going to happen, so they made it between 3 and 5. That's why Jesus had to die at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There's a reason for that. So he was offered up on the cross at the time of the morning sacrifice, but he was also died at the time of the evening sacrifice. And he had to die. That's when all the Passover lambs were being killed in the temple. Jesus was being sacrificed as the Passover lamb, bang on time. And then the rule was that he had to be buried before sunset. There's a rule that when anyone is hung on a tree, he has to be buried before the sun goes down. Because one weird theory I come across is that Jesus was only buried after, and that's how they play games with the 3 days. Oh, the Romans did, but the point is that according to for the Jews, when he actually dies, after the death, he must be buried before sunset. So he may be hanging on a tree for a long time. And now that's why they had to get them down before Passover, or before the Sabbath, because, you see, that was urgent, because he could have died the next day, say. The thieves on the cross could have died the next day, whether it be the Sabbath day or the Passover day, the first day of unleavened bread. That would have been a problem then, because the Jewish law said you must bury him before the end of the day, but if it's a Sabbath, you're not allowed to work. And that includes not burying bodies. So that's why it was urgent that they had to get those guys killed. They broke their legs. Because the Jewish law couldn't let them, which was a merciful thing for the other two. Because when they came to Jesus, he'd already died. So they didn't have to break his legs, which was another prophecy that his legs would not be broken. No bone would be broken. So Jesus was buried at about 5 o'clock, or he had to be buried before sundown. That's important. All right. So that's the Passover. And then they would eat the Passover in the evening. All right, but it would be killed on the 14th. When does it turn into the 15th? At 6 in the evening. Now you're into the 15th of Nisan. That's the first day of unleavened bread. Now you're into the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Why is it unleavened bread? Because this commemorates the Exodus. They killed the Passover lamb on the 14th. Then on the 15th, they started their exodus out of Egypt. And they were in such a rush, they didn't use leaven. So it's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a picture, of course, of us living a life of purity without leaven, but based on the sacrifice of the Passover. We eat the Passover lamb, and we walk with the Lord, eating on his unleavened word of God. So that's the feast of the first month. But then we must say that in that week was the Feast of First Fruits. And it's wonderful how Jesus fulfilled all these feasts. I'm going to do a message soon on the first fruit thing, because that's really interesting. But the day of first fruits was the day after the Sabbath. So whenever the Sabbath was that week, the next day, which is called the first day of the week, Sunday, the day after the Sabbath was designated the day of first fruits. By then, the first part of the barley harvest was ready. It was cut down and offered up to God at the time of the morning sacrifice, 9 o'clock in the morning, the first fruits of the harvest. And by giving the first fruits to God, they were giving the whole harvest to God. If the first fruits is holy, then the whole lot is holy. And the first fruits represent what the rest of the harvest is going to be like. Jesus offered himself up as the first fruits to God, and that was a resurrection. See, the harvest is resurrection. And that was a sign of what the rest of the harvest will be like. Pentecost is the feast where the whole harvest, at the end of the harvest period, the whole harvest is given to God. That is Pentecost. At first fruits, a countdown began. 9 o'clock, a countdown, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, until 50, right? 50 days, 9 o'clock in the morning, what happened? The Holy Spirit came down, because the time had fully come. All right? The time for the completed harvest. And God, in a sense, he used that to pour out the Holy Spirit on the church. My own belief is, according to feast fulfillment, that has to be when the rapture of the church is going to happen. Because the first fruits was Jesus, the countdown to the day of the completed harvest, and the completed harvest is offered up to God, which is resurrection, ascends to God on the day of Pentecost. So if you want my prediction for the rapture, it's going to be at Pentecost. But anyway, that's the feasts. And then in the 7th month, there are the 7th month feasts in September, October time. The 7th month was called Tishri. All right? And the new moon of Tishri, the first day there, is called, the first of Tishri, is the Feast of Trumpets, which the Jews celebrate as the New Year Day, even though it's the 7th month, but I kind of explain that. That's called the Feast of Trumpets. They blow their trumpets, but really what the trumpet is a warning, because there's a heavy day coming. It's the Day of Atonement. It's the Day of Repentance. And this is when you get serious, because, really the trumpets is like a warning that there's major event happening. The great Day of Atonement, I don't have time to get into that, but that's on the 10th day. Israel fasts and repents on the Day of Atonement, and of course in the old days, the great sacrifices were made. And then, having received, as it were, forgiveness for that year on the Day of Atonement, on the 15th then, 15th of the month, full moon, is of course Tabernacles, a time of great rejoicing when all the harvest is in now. It's a celebration feast of Tabernacles, and it represents the coming of Christ and the reign of Christ and the joy. I've got a message on Tabernacles, but that would last 7 days, and then there was a special 8th day as well to the Feast of Tabernacles. So that is the feast program that God has done as prophetic, but an understanding of the feasts and how they're tied into the moon. And through the lunar positions, we can actually predict when any feast day is. All right? And sometimes the Jewish calendar will be a little bit out because of that rabbi's little rules that he pokes in, which I won't go into because I don't really know them. But all right. Now, how are we doing? Got a couple of minutes. Let's see if I can take you to your lunar tables. Now, one of the great blessings on the internet is that NASA have provided tables. You can find them easily enough. In fact, the website's down there. And they give the moon phases back about 6,000 years and into the future. Because it's not a straight... There's all kinds of wobbles that the moon goes through. So it actually requires very advanced mathematics. If we didn't have these exact tables, we'd be only approximating. Now, I want to finish this session by showing you how we calculate that Passover in the year of the Lord's death was, in fact, Friday, April the 1st. All right? We'll finish by proving that. All right? So I want you to look to the bottom of your tables. I've put a helpful arrow there. And can you see that the titles? It says New Moon. Then first quarter, then the full moon, then the last quarter. Now, can you see that in the spring month, it says March the 19th. New moon, March the 19th. Can you see that? Where the arrow's pointing? 10:38. Now, that's Greenwich Mean Time. To get the Israel time, you kind of add an hour or two. All right, but it's close enough. So, I want you to notice there, at T, there was a total eclipse that day, which is interesting in itself. But anyway, March the 19th, that's when we have a dark moon. That is not when the month starts. Let me ask you this question now. We're looking at March the 19th. 6 o'clock that evening, would the moon be visible? Do you remember what the rule of thumb was? 30 hours, right? No way would the moon be visible that evening. So that evening of March the 19th, that means March the 20th would not be the start of the month. All right? The moon would not be visible. You'd have to go forward another day. I've got it written down here somewhere. I don't want to make a mistake, but, oh well. Work it out. So I think you'd have to wait till the next day, all right? By the next sunset, so March the 19th in the evening, the moon would not be visible, but the moon would be visible on the evening of March the 20th, which means the first day of the new thing is March the 21st. Okay? Starting at 6 o'clock March the 20th, but March the 21st. So, how do we get to Passover? Which day is Passover? It's the 14th. So you have to add, that's the first of Nisan. You have to add 13 days. 13 days to March the 21st. Hopefully gets you to April the 3rd. Because, of course, there are 31 days in March. All right? Again, you can do it yourself, but you get the gist of how this is done, all right? April the 3rd. Oh, Derek, I thought you said it was April the 1st. This is all, as I told you, they always give the dates in the Julian calendar. So you've got to make that 2-day adjustment. Isn't chronology fun?